All right, so this lesson's on quadratic formula, and basically the whole thing that we're trying to do right now is to solve for x with the quadratic function. So we have this quadratic function right here. As you can see, there's x in two places. We want to solve for x, so we're going to use a little bit of math magic here to figure this out. First thing we want to do, just to make our lives completely easier, and it's usually the thing you're looking for anyway, is we want to solve for f of x equal to 0. Okay, these would be considered the roots for this function. So what I'm going to do first is just add a little equals 0 here. Okay? Next thing we're going to do is I want to get rid of this c. There's a plus c right here. So what I'm going to do is subtract c from both sides. So c is going to basically cancel out here. And I'm going to end up with ax squared plus bx. And then since I'm doing 0 minus c is negative c. So I'm just going to put a little negative c in here. All right? The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this a. Okay, just to make my life a little bit easier, I just want to get rid of this ax squared right here. I just want the x squared by itself. If you remember when we went over the completing the square video, we kind of talked about how we kept the a factored out of the quadratic function. So I'm just going to basically factor it out in a way by just getting rid of this this x squared, right? Getting it off this x squared right here. If you want to, you can try it without doing this. It just leads to a little bit more work, but you end up with the same answer regardless. So I'm going to divide both sides by a. So ax squared right here divided by a would just be x squared. I'm going to write x squared in there. Plus, now I'm dividing this whole side by a, so that means that would be including bx would be divided by a, so it would be b over a times x. Okay, then I'm dividing this side by a as well, so real simple, it would just be negative c over a. Okay? Next thing we're going to do is we want to get a by itself, and a great way of doing that is completing the square. So what we're going to do here is we're going to complete this side square to kind of help us out a little bit. So hold on tight for this just to make, pay attention. So we got x squared plus b over ax. Now what I'm going to do is, to get that c term for this part right here, for the perfect square, I'm going to divide it by 2. If you remember, we have to divide it by 2 and then square it. So b over a divided by 2 is b over 2a, and then I'm going to square it. So I'm going to end up with b over 2a, and then I'm going to square it. Equals, okay, then I'm going to drop down this negative c over a right here. But now since I just added something to one side, and both sides have to be equal, what I do to one side, I equally have to do to the other. So I'm also going to add on this side plus b over 2a squared. Equal rights in math. Okay, so I added b over 2a squared to both sides. The next thing I can do now, because I have a perfect square right here, I can factor it out. So that's what I'm going to do right now. So I end up with x plus b over 2a quantity squared. Now you can check my work if you want, multiply this by itself, and you should notice that you'll get this value right here. Okay? Just reverse factoring basically to get this. Okay? Then I'm going to drop this down. Right here. And what I'm going to do here is actually I'm going to simplify. When you're squaring something in parentheses, that means you just square the top and the bottom. So I'm going to do b squared, and then I'm going to square 2a, which is just going to end up equal 4a squared. Because I squared the 2 to get 4, a squared is a squared. So I end up with something like this. Okay, I want to get rid of this squared here, right here, but just to kind of clean things up a little bit, I want to combine these if I can, right? And I definitely can. I just have to make sure that the denominators are the same. So to do that, I'm just going to multiply this value right here by 4a. Both sides, 4a over 4a. So that way this bottom part will be 4a squared. So what I'm going to do here is get rid of this little minus sign right here, multiply it by 4a. The minus sign just went over here. And then I multiply this bottom side by 4a. So I'm going to end up with a 4a squared here. And because the two denominators are equal, what I, in essence, can do is combine these like so, where I can put a plus sign right here and divide this all by 4a squared. Okay? Because they have the same denominator, I can add them, and you get something like this. Now it looks a little bit neater, although it's still a little crazy, but it's a lot neater than what it was before because I combined them with a common denominator. All right, so getting back to what we were talking about before, getting rid of this squared. You should know to get rid of the squared, you just do the opposite of that, which would be raising it to the half power or square rooting it. So what I'm going to do is square root both sides, square root that, and then I'm going to square root this whole mess right here. Okay? Now the square root of this whole thing squared, obviously the square just canceled, and you end up with x plus b over 2a. Okay? And this is going to be equal to, okay, well, since I'm taking the square root, it's the same thing as taking the square root of both the top and the bottom. You can't do much with the top. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to write this b squared first. So I'm going to write b squared minus 4ac. And I'm just going to square root this. Now what's great about this is we can square root the bottom part. So this whole thing is being the square root of, square root is taken of it. So I'm going to take the square root of 4ac, and the square root of 4 would be 2, and the square root of a squared would just be a. Okay? So now you're probably like, oh wow, we're almost at the finish line here, and you're right. We are almost done, but the one thing you have to remember when you're taking the square root of something, it's the plus or minus of that. So what I'm going to do here is, okay, let me write it up here real quick. It's the plus or minus of it, because if you take the negative, if you square a negative of something, it becomes positive. If you square a positive, it's still positive as well. So either answer will still work. Okay? And if you go back to the top right here where the quadratic function, the highest order is 2, that kind of gives you a little hint on how many roots or how many answers you could expect. Usually, I can think of one time when it doesn't happen where you just get one answer. But usually you would get 2 answers. And this is where the 2 answers come from, this plus or minus. Let me make this a little bit here. So the plus or minus. This plus or minus is going to still be continuing down here. So this whole thing would be the plus or minus of this whole mess right here. To get rid of this b over 2a, you should know you just subtract b over 2a from both sides. So then I got to kind of squat down a little bit here. You end up with x because we subtracted b over 2a from both sides. And then, so what I'm going to do here is just write b over 2a plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, that whole quantity, all over 2a. Now, if you're clever, you might notice that both of these denominators are the exact same. Can we combine them? Of course we can. So that's what I'm actually going to do. I'm going to erase this 2a and this 2a right here. Erase this plus or minus. I'm going to combine these right here. Put the plus or minus right there. Again, that's our 2 answers because you got to do negative b plus this and negative b minus this. But let's add the 2a in there. And if you notice, we ended up solving for x and having the quadratic formula. You're going to get 2 answers, usually, for this. And you'll be able to solve for x. We have it by itself, and that's the quadratic formula. I'll put a little box underneath around it here. And hopefully that helps. Let me know if you have any questions.